Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Law Shanty. It's a little cold here in the Shanty today. We're going to talk about some quarantine issues and some isolation issues and how where we are now in the pandemic has affected those issues. And some of this stuff we're going to talk about, you're not going to be very happy about, like the 14-day quarantine period. So whenever I know you're going to be mad at me, I bring somebody else in to talk about these things. So I brought DeAndre Harrison today to help us out. DeAndre is an associate in the Labor and Employment Practice Group. He's one of our brilliant young associates, and he's been keeping up on all this COVID stuff, keeping us in line, letting us know what's going on and what we're doing. So I appreciate that. DeAndre is also practices in the OSHA, kind of MIOSHA area. So some of you might know him from that. So say hi, DeAndre.
Everyone, thanks for having me.
All right, you ready? Let's get into it. See if I can stump you. Got some questions here for you about quarantines and COVID. I'm really excited. All right, DeAndre, let's start with this one. So the pandemic has changed, obviously, and now we've got a vaccine, and the vaccine is now becoming widely available. So how does the increased accessibility of the vaccine impact employers' isolation and quarantine protocols for employees who are exposed to or have symptoms of COVID-19?
Yeah, so for employees who are exposed to or have symptoms of COVID-19, Michigan Public Act 238, which was amended by Public Act 339 in December of last year, that's the law that Michigan employers have to follow with respect to isolating and quarantine requirements. Under that law, essentially the terms isolation and quarantine, those are actually defined, or they rely on the CDC guidance. And so, in other words, employees are required to follow the recommendations that the CDC issues relating to quarantine and isolating for COVID-19. That's a long way of saying the CDC guidance currently has guidance out there relating to when individuals who have been fully vaccinated and whether they need to quarantine or not. And essentially what that guidance says is those individuals don't have an obligation to quarantine following an exposure to COVID-19 if they are fully vaccinated and asymptomatic. And then finally, with respect to fully vaccinated, that's I guess a legal term of art, if you will, for our purposes, because what employers want to know when an employee says, hey, I've been vaccinated, I'm all fine, I don't need to quarantine, we need to know if they're fully vaccinated. And so what that means is if they've had the Pfizer or Moderna shot, we want to confirm that they've gone at least 2 weeks since their second dose in that series. That's when they're fully vaccinated. And then for purposes of us, with respect to Johnson & Johnson, we just want to confirm that they've gone at least 2 weeks since their one and done shot.
So that's good news for employers. A fully vaccinated employee then doesn't have to quarantine, they can come right back to work. Any employee who's symptomatic, we have to treat them like a positive or symptomatic and follow those rules?
That's right. Yeah. So if you're ever talking about someone who is symptomatic, then we're looking at the standard, 10 days since the onset of symptoms if they're symptomatic, and then also 24 hours with no fever if they, have a fever, and then an improvement of symptoms.
Okay. All right. So what about, that's vaccinated, fully vaccinated people. That's me. I'm very happy about that. Thank you very much. What about this? See, there's one advantage to being old, right? There you go. What about employees who've already had COVID? Maybe they haven't been vaccinated, but they've had the disease already. Can we treat them any differently now?
So this is the classic, lawyer answer. It depends, right? We want to look at a few different circumstances to make sure that they check the boxes according to CDC guidance. The first one is, when was their last, case of COVID or their first case of COVID? If it was within 90 days, then that's a good sign. So we want to make sure that they're within that window of 90 days since they were first symptomatic, or if they were asymptomatic during their first case, since 90 days since they tested positive that first time. We also want to make sure, though, that they have actually recovered from that first case. So making sure that they don't have old symptoms still, and that, they are asymptomatic for present purposes. If they're asymptomatic for present purposes and they fully recovered from that first case, as long as we're within that 90-day window, those employees don't have to quarantine if they've been exposed to COVID-19.
And that's also good news for employers, given the fact that so many people in Michigan, I mean, we're up to like 800,000 people that have had the disease at this point. So,
yeah.
So that's good news too. All right, so here's the question I've got. And I know a lot of employers have had this too, because the state of Michigan now has said we're going back to this 14-day quarantine period from the 10-day one that we were using before. If the public act that you're talking about, which is the law, relies on the CDC definition of isolation and quarantine, particularly in this case, quarantine, how come employers don't get to rely on that 10-day shortened period or the 7 days in a test period? Why are we back to the 14 days?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, I'm saying a ton of like common legal phrases during this segment, but you got to read the fine print during the CDC, guys. and what I mean by that is, with respect to those alternative methods for quarantine, the CDC defers to public health departments in determining whether or not it's appropriate to implement either of those methods that you've mentioned, the 10-day framework or the 7-day shortened period. The public health department has the final say-so on whether it's appropriate to implement either of those methods in their jurisdictions. And because, as you've mentioned, last Monday, on April 5th, the Department of Health and Human Services went back to the standard 14-day quarantine period because of, an increase in COVID-19 cases, and then also an increase in variant spread as well. And so the long and short of it is really, unless employees fall within, those two exceptions that we've just discussed, or they fall within one of those other exceptions that's listed in Public Act 339, they have to quarantine for 14 days.
And those exceptions we're talking about in the act are for specific kinds of employees, first responders and stuff like that. So generally for most employers, if your employee's not vaccinated or not already had the disease and they're in close contact, it's now 14 days. And that's what we've got to deal with until case counts go down again, hopefully.
That's right.
All right, one more thing. So I've gotten a couple of questions recently from clients asking me to look at their protocols, because they're still using the same questionnaire, this questionnaire that we have to give all employees, a screening questionnaire, to make sure that that questionnaire is still valid. And one of the questions we're getting again is, given that the vaccine is now coming out, do I still have to use that questionnaire? Or can I just put a poster up and then have my people swipe their badge when they come in, and that's good enough? That means that they answered the appropriate answer to all the questions. Can I go now to a badge system or an entry card system or something like that? Or do I still have to use the questionnaire?
So the Michigan Occupational Safety and Health Administration, MIOSHA, recently issued an FAQ that relates to this exact issue. And I encourage employers to regularly monitor the FAQs that MIOSHA issues under its emergency rules, because they are super helpful and they fill in a bit of the gaps that are included in the rules themselves. And the answer to this question is no. Employers cannot rely on a swiping or card access login system for purposes of satisfying that health screening requirement under the emergency rules. And when you look at that FAQ, MIOSHA provides some additional reasons for why. And mainly what they say is that the questionnaire is designed to be independent, distinct, and also capable of soliciting individual employee responses. And taking that framework and applying it to a card swipe system, essentially there's some defects that MIOSHA finds, which is, employees can swipe in without paying attention to that posting. And then also it really just acts as a stand-in or proxy to that framework that we've talked about with respect to questionnaires. And so what MIOSHA is looking for is, some verbal responses from employees. Employers can use a verbal Q&A, questionnaire, or a paper form, or an electronic method as well. And, it's important that employers also keep in mind that we also have obligation to maintain records of these screening protocols as well. And so I think that that's another deficiency that the swiping or card access method has for purposes of the rules.
Okay, well, that's enough for today, I guess, huh? Keep people on their toes. Two things I'd like to remind you of. Number one, if you haven't looked at that questionnaire since the start of the pandemic, you might want to think about doing that. Lots of things have changed. Travel restrictions have changed, for example. The symptoms have actually changed. You know, we look at the symptoms differently now. You have a group of symptoms where you only need one symptom and a group where you need two or more. So you should probably look at your questionnaire and see if it's still up to date if you haven't been doing that. And if you need help with that, we can help you with that. The other thing that I would point out to you is it's Monday afternoon when we're recording this. And we just got confirmation again that the MIOSHA emergency rules that DeAndre is an expert in are going to be extended for a full 6 months. Of course, you know, we don't know what they're going to say yet, but they're going to be extended. They run out. Well, by the time you guys see this in one day, on the 14th will be the last day. So hopefully by Wednesday, we'll have new rules. And if we do, and if there's significant changes in them, we'll put out a special episode and we'll see you again. Thank you very much, DeAndre. You've been a great help. See y'all soon.